Hi, I'm Max Keiser. This is the Keiser Report. So, Herman Cain, governor of the Bank of England, says that we're facing the worst financial crisis in history. Had he been watching this show, he would have known that this has been the case now for many, many months. He also goes on to say that he does watch the Keiser Report, but he doesn't have enough financial literacy to understand what we're saying on this show. Herman Cain, step aside. Bring in Stacy Herbert, who should be running the Bank of England.
I would bury it the first day I was running it. He neglected to mention, of course, why we are in the worst financial catastrophe of all time, and that's because of the Central Bank of England and America and the rest of the world and the top 1% that they represent. And you know there's this building war, this global insurrection against banker occupation, the 99% against the 1%. So here's the 1% responding. Headline reads, Chicago Board of Trade taunts Occupy Chicago, we are the 1%. You know, the Occupy Wall Street spread to Chicago, and you see this photo here, Max. This is from the Chicago Board of Trade, and they put up posters inside saying, we are the 1%.
Well, Chicago Board of Options, Stacy Herbert, of course, is the site of listed options back in the 1970s, the beginning of derivatives, as that term is understood today. And these are kind of the ground zero of financial terrorists. The Chicago School of Economics is there. This is where Obama came from, and Milton Friedman, the neoliberal school. And these fellows should not be so cocky because the mob is beginning to circle, I can say maybe in those terms. In other words, it's not as if these people can simply disappear once they punch the clock and leave the Chicago Board of Options Exchange. I mean, they're living, breathing human beings. For how long?
Well, many people don't know this, but Marie Antoinette actually did the same thing. She hung a poster outside of Versailles saying, I am the 1%. And here's an image from the 1800s, I guess, and this is a picture of her being led to the guillotine. And I have another picture here, Max. This is the actual blade used to cut her head off soon after she put up her banner saying, I am the 1%.
I've got a bid on that. I'd like to add that to my collection, my Robespierrean collection of Reign of Terror memorabilia, with prices for Reign of Terror memorabilia are skyrocketing all over the world as people begin to remember some of the actions that they can take.
Yes, and I'm not advocating that. I'm just saying this is what happens in history.
Well, I've been saying, you know, that you need to have something in your back pocket to scare the bankers with. If Hank Paulson can say we need a $3 trillion bazooka to scare the banks into giving us more money, then the 99% can say we've got the guillotine.
So let's move on to Herman Cain. Wall Street protests are un-American, he says. He's Republican presidential candidate, Herman Cain. And he says that the Wall Street protesters are un-American and against capitalism, and, quote, that protesters shouldn't rally against Wall Street bankers or brokers because they're the ones who create the jobs.
Well, Herman Cain is completely wrong on this point. I mean, the Wall Street is there to allocate capital, and here you have Herman Cain and current iteration of Wall Street, which is vast concentration of capital. This is, of course, the complete opposite of what is supposed to happen with an allocation that's equitable and creates jobs. He's destroying jobs.
Exactly, and that's you were saying at the top of the show that Herman Cain is saying this is the worst financial catastrophe in the history of the universe. And why? It's because bankers have misallocated capital. That's their single job. They're supposed to allocate capital into productive enterprises,
right,
not into fraud and casinos and scams.
Right, and how do they do that? They do that by using derivatives to steer the risk of capitalism into the public domain, and they keep the reward. When derivatives and the options volatility formula is kind of like the splitting of the atom. You know, they split capitalism between risk and reward and created a financial nuclear bomb in which they keep all of the reward and all the risk is rotting in the rest of the society.
And he also says it's un-American. If you want to look at what is American and what isn't, just look up Thomas Jefferson or John Adams, or what they said about bankers and Wall Street. I mean, they make us look tame.
Right. Jefferson famously thought that bankers were the biggest threat to liberty. You know, going back to 1999, remember the anti-globalization movement, as it was called back then. They had the battle in Seattle, and there was a huge outcry at that time against globalization. Now, 10, 11 years later, you've got the Naomi Kleins and the Michael Moores, and these people finally realize it's the bankers, stupid.
And now one banker has gone to jail over the last 3 years, and that's Bernie Madoff. And everybody says that was a bad apple. The rest of the system is fine, and the financial system has collapsed by pure sheer coincidence. Nothing happened to cause it. So we're going to turn to this headline: Madoff whistleblower tells King World News banks stealing from pensions. Now this is Harry Markopolos. He's the one that 10 years before the Madoff fraud collapsed, he was the one that wrote to the SEC a 10, 15-page letter outlining exactly why Bernie Madoff was a Ponzi scheme and how it was operating. Well, Harry Markopolos is involved in this lawsuit against Bank of New York Mellon. He's the one that gave all the evidence to the Attorney General of New York. And let's turn to this clip from King World News.
Every day, every time a state pension fund traded, the bank would steal approximately 0.3% from every transaction. Every time a pension fund bought a currency, the bank would mark a high price for the day. They would look back, because currency trades in a 24-hour clock. What the Bank of New York would do is look back 20 hours and assign all the state pension funds purchase transactions at the high of the day. And every time a state pension fund tried to sell a currency, they would assign them a price at the lows of the day. And they would pocket the difference. And they did that not for just 10 years, but for decades. Every day for decades.
Well, it brings up 3 points as I count them. Number one, that pension funds are abused. This is where banks dump risk. When they make a bad bet and it's a losing bet, they dump it in a pension account. I myself have done this on Wall Street many times when I was working on Wall Street. We did these look-back trades.
Is this your Jim Cramer moment?
Well, I've said this before. You know, you put on a big option trade, a volatility trade at the end of the day. You don't give an account number to the options dealer on the desk, you know, because they're in line for a big Christmas bonus. And then at the end of the day, if it's a loser, you dump it into a pension account or you give it to a corporation for a tax loss. If it's a winner, you go into an account that you've already got a prearranged relationship with where there's a massive kickback. And this is most of the trading on Wall Street is like this. Number two, the scam itself of skimming pennies, skimming small amounts of money on every single transaction. It went completely unnoticed for years and years and years. What did I say last week? If you introduced a Tobin tax, which is exactly the amount of money we're talking about here, nobody would notice it. I got emails from people saying, of course, people would notice it. It would destroy the banking industry. You can't introduce a Tobin tax. But here you have a perfect example. They stole a certain percentage of every single transaction. Nobody noticed it for decades. It's similar with a Tobin tax, a small 0.5% or 1% transaction fee. Not a single person would notice it if you never told them.
So this is essentially a Tobin tax that Bank of New York Mellon has been imposing upon the bottom 99%. But dare you suggest that we reverse that and take that back from the 1% and with a Tobin tax? They're like screeching that this is un-American, this is anti-capitalist. Well, what is it when Bank of New York Mellon does that to the 99% of their customers?
Right. It's fraud, but they say it's fraud in the service of liquidity and market making. Same thing Goldman Sachs says. Lloyd Blankfein, when he goes to Congress, he says, yes, we commit fraud every day, but we need it to keep markets open. Now, the third point, of course, is that this revelation will go unheeded. Nobody will act on it. They're part of a criminal syndicate. This is why they go unpunished, because they're not being prosecuted as a racket, under RICO.
To explain to the audience who the Bank of New York Mellon is, here's the Wikipedia on them. They have $1.2 trillion in assets under management and $25.5 trillion in assets under custody and administration, thereby being the largest deposit bank in the world. It is the oldest banking corporation in the United States, tracing its origins to the establishment of the Bank of New York in 1784 by Alexander Hamilton.
Right, and those are passive accounts from old ladies sitting on fortunes. And every single month they get their statement and they get out their magnifying glass and they try to figure out if the bank stole money from them this month, but they're very good at doing it, so they can't pick it up. Or their pension accounts, or their teachers, or their firemen. Remember, all these public workers' accounts, they're being vilified because they want a living wage. Meanwhile, their pensions are being destroyed by Bank of New York and other banks, so they're getting really gang-banged from both directions.
Well, Harry Markopolos points out in the interview that if you have a pension, basically you have been defrauded by Bank of New York Mellon because everything passes through there. That's the 25.5 trillion in assets. It flows through there as the deposit bank.
So emphasize that point as far as the infrastructure goes in management of the pension fund industry. They are at a key choke point in that whole infrastructure, and as gatekeepers, they're bandits essentially, because as the money goes through the system, they stand there as a gatekeeper or as a bandit, and they steal on every single transaction. And now it's just becoming revealed. The attorney general will have to be bought off or bribed or caught in a sex scandal, so no prosecution, and nothing will come of this.
And now, importantly, there's the Occupy Wall Street. They're trying to get to New York Stock Exchange. Right around the corner is the Bank of New York Mellon, surrounded by police. And here's the last clip from Harry Markopolos I want to play.
If Al-Qaeda had done this to Americans, SEAL Team 6 will be dropping in, but the banks did that. And so maybe law enforcement needs to drop into those corporate boardrooms and treat them like SEAL Team 6 treated Osama bin Laden. These bankers think they're above the law. They're arrogant. They're saying they're going to defend. They say they're innocent, yet they refuse to set trial dates. And they're stealing from tens of millions of Americans. And by the way, Bank of New York Mellon's a TARP bank, so we bailed them out so they could pay bonuses by stealing our pension money.
Duh, we've been saying these are financial terrorists. Now, finally, other people are comparing them to other terrorists. There's a strong case to be made that, yes, these are financial terrorists. Number two, America has the death penalty already. They're already killing dozens and hundreds of people in states like Texas, okay? Instead of focusing on killing poor black people, why not go after the rich white guys on Wall Street? You've already got the death penalty in place. Pull the frickin' trigger, you wusses.
So like he said, SEAL Team 6, those police protecting Bank of New York Mellon from the protesters, their pension funds have been defrauded by the bank behind them that they're protecting. Why don't they take the bank, drop it into the ocean somewhere, put it on an airplane, fly it over the Atlantic, and drop it in the ocean?
Right, they're the cops in front of the bank, trying to protect the bank from the protesters. And behind their back, the banks are ripping them off blind, you stupid frickin' cop idiots! Stacy Herbert, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Max.
Don't go away, much more coming away, so stay right there.
Life in Russia would be so much brighter if you knew more about someone from first impressions. Meetfriends.rt.com.
Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Oh boy, here it is. This is the book I've been waiting for. Investing in Troubled Times by Charles Hugh Smith. Big fans of Charles Hugh Smith. Welcome to the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Max.
Charles Hugh Smith, you are here in Europe, a land that you describe as a neo-feudal kleptocracy of 500 million debt serfs. Tell us more.
Well, Max, as you've covered on the show many times, it seems that we have to ask who is the recipient of all the sacrifices being asked of the European people, both the taxpayers in Germany and elsewhere, and those who are being suffering under the austerity programs of Greece, etc. And then it seems that the answer is not the people of those countries, but the banks, which overextended massive quantities of debt to the sovereign states and to the individuals.
Right, well, this is a point that's being made more and more. People understand that the banks are at the heart of the problem. Now you've got this Occupy Wall Street campaign all over the world. Remember, they used to call it anti-globalization, and now they figured out, well, you know, behind these companies are the banks. So we're going to focus on the banks. And yet there is still nobody standing up in the political arena to say, like a Pecora Commission of the 1930s, where they said, you know what, we got to go in there and start arresting some of these scoundrels. What's your thought on that?
Absolute agreement. First, we have to establish as a society what is right and wrong. And clearly, the status quo would have us believe in sort of a Jedi mind trick that looting, as long as it's under the auspices of the status quo, is not a wrong. It's like normal.
You mentioned looting, and I immediately think of what's happened in London recently. They had a looting spree from folks, and David Cameron, the Prime Minister, came out in very harsh terms castigating those looters. And yet he wouldn't be in the Prime Minister unless it were for the looting of the bankers who paid for his election campaign. So why do the British people accept the fact that their Prime Minister is looter-in-chief? But shouldn't they just be giving banking licenses to the kids who are breaking into shops on the street, and they can grow the economy by looting that way?
Yeah, and you could ask perhaps the same question of Ireland and Greece. How are those people accepting the idea that their nations are being looted fundamentally to save the banks and the owners of the banks and their political lackeys?
Let's talk about the U.S. for a second. You write that the stealth coup d'etat of 2008 to 2010. So, what's going on there?
I think it's the culmination of this buying of the political process by the financial sector that reached its apex in 2008. And so lackeys of both parties across the entire political spectrum, you know, did whatever was necessary to save their financial masters, essentially.
All right, and so now we've got the latest incarnation of the anti-globalization movement. It's called Occupy Wall Street, and you've got Naomi Klein, I think, has finally figured this one out, and she's joining the barricades. So what do you make of the protest?
I think it's useful, and I think those people are heroes to stand up in public. They're heroes, but I think that we can also look at what everybody that's not there could do. And this ties into your campaign of buying silver. In other words, what kind of direct actions can everyone do from the safety of their home without risking arrest? And so buying silver, closing your accounts at major banks, either reneging on your loans that you can never pay or paying them off. I mean, exiting yourself from being a supporter of the banking, the
All right,
financial
so you mentioned
sector.
three things there. One is to, what about a mass default on mortgages across the country on one designated day? That would certainly put the kibosh on the banks, no?
That's a great idea.
So Occupy Wall Street should pick a day in the next couple of weeks and say that we demand that the country, the United States of America, everyone who's got an underwater mortgage for sure, or anyone who wants to strategically default on their mortgage, do it today. This would put the banks under, and it would force the government to create a new bank that was clean, that simply did deposits and made loans at a reasonable price, and they exactly what happened during the S&L crisis.
Yeah, and as a follow-up, the citizenry could demand that instead of 5 banks which control everything and are therefore too big to fail, that by regulation there has to be at least 250 banks, say, or 1,250, a vast number of banks which are unable to amass the concentration of wealth to buy the political process.
Right, I think that's called competition.
Yeah, it's a strange concept in some ideology called capitalism, which we used to have, you know.
Well, let me ask you about that, because Michael Moore has made a big thing about being anti-capitalist, and yet we don't have a capitalist system, because capitalism means competition, and he wouldn't have had this problem to begin with. Where is he getting it wrong?
I think there's so-called classical capitalism that is that we're basically told exists across the spectrum, and exists still in small ways. Like you can go out and become an independent contractor as a capitalist, or you can be Steve Jobs and start a computer company without any political pull. And but I think what most people miss is that spectrum of classical capitalism is a rather narrow band of the entire economy, globally and certainly in the U.S. And then the part that's controlled by those with immense concentrations of wealth and political power control like 80 to 90%. And that's crony capitalism or cartel capitalism.
All right, now my friend Alex Jones, he's making a move to go now even deeper into the disease by going from Occupy Wall Street to Occupy the Fed. And he's targeting the Dallas Fed as part of this Texas initiative. Is that, in your mind, the right direction?
Absolutely. And what's interesting, Max, is how we see this movement gathering force at either end of the spectrum. That we have some leftists realizing that the Fed has got to be brought under the Treasury, and then from the right, Ron Paul is like, abolish the Fed. I mean, either one is a move in the right direction. So maybe we're getting some consensus.
Right. The Fed should be under the Treasury. That's a proposal by Dennis Kucinich.
Yes.
And which is pretty much the exact idea of audit the Fed, or what Ron Paul has been talking about. What about this idea that Dennis Kucinich says nationalize the Fed, put it under the Treasury, effectively making it transparent within the government's ability to do so? But is that a good idea?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, as to whether we should have a Fed is a secondary question, but certainly if we have one, then it should be under the Treasury, which is nominally under the elected government.
Right. So what would be the objection? I mean, if you said to the Fed, look, we're just going to put you under the Treasury Department. You report to Tim Geithner now, Ben Bernanke, and we're going to put a guy in Tim Geithner's office to make sure he is not doing too many horrible things. What could they say back as to why that's not a good idea?
Well, I think the Jedi mind trick is we need an independent Fed owned by the banks to make the correct policy for the elected government.
Right, but Alan Greenspan kind of blew that concept of independent Fed by every single time there was a political problem in Washington. He lowered interest rates,
Yeah.
which created the bubble, which created the enormous banking fraud, which created this massive depression. Now, you mentioned silver a moment ago, and we did the Crash JP Morgan Buy Silver campaign. It caught huge attention all over the world. Price of silver at that time was $26, rocketed up to $50 an ounce. There's been a pullback down to the 30 range. Still in a bull market, still looking good. But walk us through how that works. You're taking physical silver off the market, so how does that crash the banks?
Well, actually, you're probably more adept at that argument than I am, and you've made it many times and better than I can. But I think the key function to me is silver, amongst many other commodities, is actually traded as a commodity, and the futures far exceed the actual physical product, right? So if we, the people, go out and physically own most of the physical product, then that reduces the amount that's available for leverage and financialization.
Right. The banking crisis is due almost entirely to over-leverage, which is fueled by speculation. And the cost of speculating is near zero because interest rates are near zero thanks to this corrupt Fed.
Yes.
And anytime they make a mistake, they dump it into a pension account somewhere. And it's all, however, still stacked on top of something physical at the base of the Ponzi scheme.
That's right.
Now, so if I take $100 of silver out of the Ponzi scheme, I am decapitalizing the Ponzi scheme by probably close to $1,000 at this point.
Yes.
That's how incredibly leveraged this system is.
Yes.
So it would cause, again, the Ponzi scheme to crash, which sounds horrifying unless you realize that it's a Ponzi scheme banking cancer and you're trying to get rid of the cancer.
That's right.
So it's the leverage needs to be removed, and you do that by taking the fundamental layer out of this layer cake of fraud, as it were. Now, we've got Herman Cain, who's running for president. He recently stated that the Occupy Wall Street protesters are un-American, for its bankers that create jobs. Your thoughts?
One wonders at the audacity of that statement.
The audacity of cluelessness. That should be his campaign slogan.
Yeah, if the bankers create so many jobs and they've been ascendant for at least the last decade, then we should have zero unemployment. But actually what they're really good at is not creating jobs. They're good at creating wealth off the backs of people who still have jobs.
Yeah, they're parasites.
Yeah, they're absolutely parasitic. And you can look at a mortgage as the equivalent of the physical gold, that you're making your payment or your student loan or whatever, you're making a payment of $100, and they're leveraging that and turning that into a financialization scheme that supports $1,000 of speculation.
Yeah,
so
they're zombie banks, and you're just giving your plasma to keep the zombie mobile, even though they died years ago.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, I'm talking to the one and only Charles Hugh Smith. This is the book, Investing in Troubled Times. I suggest you read this with alacrity. One last question. Your post, imagining a middle class does not create one. Tell us, what is a middle class? What does create a middle class? Why is a middle class even necessary? We got about a minute left.
If you tell people they're middle class, then they tend to become passive and they say, you know, oh, this is wonderful. It's kind of like it's managing perception as opposed to their actual financial circumstance, which is
another
deteriorating.
Jedi mind trick?
It's totally a
Are you a
Jedi
big Star Wars fan? What is up with this?
Yeah, I didn't bring my lightsaber, but yeah, it's very much like a movie script that we're being told we're middle class, even as the middle class as defined by security and a financial situation which is slowly improving over time is deteriorating.
Well, many people in America now believe that they are in the middle class, when in fact, when you compare their status to the G20 nations, they're barely out of poverty.
That's right, and compared to what they used to earn 30 years ago, or even 20 years ago, then their income has declined.
Right, so the folks in the banks in Washington are hitting this middle class button, and people believe it, even though the truth is their wealth, income, and status is crashing.
Yeah, and if they faced up to that, if they accepted the reality, then they'd have to become more politically active.
Yeah, I'm a serf, I'm a peasant.
Yeah.
And where's the pitchforks? Where's the guillotine?
Absolutely.
It's all in Star Wars. All right, well, Charles Hugh Smith, thanks for being on the show. That's all the time we have.
Okay, thank you very much, Max. My pleasure.
All right, and that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. I want to thank my guest, Charles Hugh Smith. This is the book. Burn that in your mind. This is a Jedi mind trick, by the way. If you want to send me an email, please do so at keiserreport@rttv.ru. Until next time, this is Max Keiser saying bye, y'all.